Gianighian. Now, Dr. Gianighian is talking about image and charity, the Scuole Grandi and their housing policy. He's a specializer in Venice in the restoration of historic buildings, and he's at the Department of Architectural Conservation at the University of Venice. I think some of you might well remember his wonderful exhibition, Dietro Palazzi, with Paola Pavanini, and also the interesting text that came out of the exhibition. I'm not quite sure which one came first. Did they came together. The catalogue of the exhibition. So, can I introduce him to you, Dr. Gianighian?
I wish to thank Deborah Howard and the Architectural Association of London for the invitation to speak to you today to the housing policies of the Scuole Grandi. In this work, I have profited, in the first instance, from the studies of Brian Pullan, Rich and Poor in Renaissance Venice, as well as from the work of other scholars such as Susan Cannell, Richard Goy, Andrei Virobits, and Richard Goldswaite, of course, on technical and economic aspects of building in the Gothic and Renaissance periods. The material I am presenting today has benefited greatly from the researches and the help of Paola Pavanini. How did the Scuole Grandi build their houses in 16th century Venice? This is the question that we are addressing this afternoon as the starting point for a broader, more comprehensive investigation. The aim is to move towards an overall identification of the real estate owned by the Scuole in Venice itself, followed by a comparison between the activities of these societies and those of other civic institutions, such as the Procuratori of St. Mark, the powerful body entrusted with the execution of so many wills, in their capacity as commissari. I want to emphasize that this is work in progress, so don't shoot on the piano player, please. And we'll go forward depending on my strength, of course, but also on the opening up of various sections of the Venetian State Archives. Many of you are, I think, well aware of difficulties and frustrations that accompany anyone who tries to work in the Venetian archives. I have analyzed the properties of the 5 Scuole Grandi, the 6th, San Teodoro, owned almost nothing in terms of real estate, as they existed in the last decades of the 16th century, not taking into account what else came to them at a later period. These estates had been piling up during previous centuries, at least for the older Scuole, whereas for the younger Scuola of San Rocco, the accumulation will be consistent in the next centuries. Be that as it may, what is certain is that the Scuole, all of them, are, during the 16th century, engaged in relevant programs of building modernization. It goes from the important complex in Corte dei Balloni, Mercerie, to the almshouses in Corte Nuova, Misericordia, from the double row, the double terrace at Crosechieri, Carità, to the many relevant activities of the Scuola di San Rocco, which include 17 flats at San Steen, 15 at Santa Croce, the important 4-flat building of Castelforte San Rocco, as well as many others. A vigorous building activity was in progress, and this is just another element in a general picture in which housing in Venice steadily increases, according to Ennio Concina, starting at least from the 1530s and probably before that. The activity of the Scuole is therefore part of the many provisions taken in the city to deal with the demographic growth that characterizes the century as a whole, up to the Great Plague of the 70s. The housing property of the Scuole undergoes a process of modernization and increase, which goes hand in hand with important renovations imposed on the seats of the Scuole. All of it designed to give a striking, magnificent image to present a new imposing look for the fraternities, coherent with their new role. Now, what is the image that they aim to their housing in both rental and charity properties? And what is the level of expenditure that they are willing to commit themselves to in comparison with the huge amount of money invested in the new seats? Let's remember, without going into details, that 80,000 ducats were spent by the Scuola of San Rocco in the course of the difficult building of its albergo, at least as transmitted to us in the harsh criticism of Caravia. The seat of each scuola is bound to indicate and underline the new, different role they are to play in this century as an element of the complex policy of state control of the poor. This aspect has been thoroughly analyzed by Brian Pullan, while Manfredo Tafuri has clarified the meanings of the individual architectural choices. Is it possible that new duties, basically of a political and charitable character rather than directed toward prayer and devotion, could also be expressed in the style and conception of residential building built by the Scuole? First of all, let's consider size and site of properties of the Scuole in Venice. Let me note, as a necessary preliminary statement, that while the size of their housing property is more or less known, or in any case not too difficult to discover, it is much more difficult is to try to identify this property on a map. It is a well-known fact that the first cadastre of Venice was drawn only in Napoleonic times. It gives the only possible start from any attempt to localize any given building. On the other hand, at that moment, the property of the Scuole Grandi had already been expropriated in favor either of the city or, in lesser extent, of the demanio. Therefore, we only find the Scuole once in a while as owners, in the sommarioni, in the land registers. one road of research is provided by a certain register of the Statistica Demaniale, which lists each item of property pertaining to the suppressed fraternities. But it must be used with caution. It occasionally lapses into error and, furthermore, gives the state of things at the beginning of the 19th century, while the focus of our research is 2 centuries earlier. What one has to do is to compare 19th century information with condizioni di decima, a kind of rent roll, presented by Scuole in 1581. This comparison can sometimes be misleading. In a case, for example, where one scuola owns more than a single building in the same parish. Moreover, while the condizione gives the number of flats of each building, this does not apply to the 19th century document, whose information is limited to the numero civico, to the house number. Let's give an example. According to the Statistica Demaniale, the Scuole of San Giovanni owns many houses in the parish of San Simeon Grande. Precisely which houses are the 8 houses are given Amore Dei, listed in the condizione? To get more information, I have also made reference to the Inquisitori and Revisori sopra le Scuole Grandi, where a rather complete list of scuole estates is given. The location of buildings is somewhat more detailed and overall better information is provided. A few specific difficulties must also be noted. The Scuola della Carità does not give any information in its condizione of assigning any almshouses. It is hard to imagine that this, one of the richest among the confraternities, would not practice this form of charity. Most probably, they simply did not list their almshouses in their tax declaration. So we have taken into account the almshouses assigned by the Scuola in the 18th century. On the other hand, the Scuola of San Marco neither declares the 24 almshouses managed by them as trustees of Commissario Olivieri, nor makes clear that their 16 houses in Santa Croce are given free. In short, the problems are many, and a certain level of error unavoidable. So, on one side, buildings as an investment, the profit of which went to financing the multifarious range of charity assigned by the Scuole. On the other side, large groups of small dwellings given free to poor brothers of the Scuola or to Galeotti, generally to the deserving poor. Taking into account not single, isolated houses, but only blocks of at least 8 houses, either built by the Scuole themselves with their own funds or managed by them in their capacity of as trustees, the almshouses are as follows. 44, may I have the shutters down, please? Thank you. Oh, there is, I'm sorry. Where is it? Thank you. 44 dwellings in one group given by the Scuola di San Rocco. 63 in 4 different complexes at San Giovanni. 54 by the Misericordia. 40 by San Marco, and at least 10 by the Carità. As for rent houses, they can be estimated to carry a profit of a little less than 10,000 ducats per year, rather unequally shared among the 5 scuole. As one can immediately perceive, I'm afraid it's projector number 1. This is Ennio Conscience. Do you think it's possible to enlarge it? Because there is a lot of work there. Oh, great, thank you. Do you think the focus? Oh, you're doing that. As one can immediately perceive, the buildings owned by Scuole, and those are the buildings built by Scuole, all the rounds you can see, appear to be dispersed throughout the city, following no special pattern, allowing a higher density in the sestiere of Dorsoduro. There does not seem any possibility of tracing out a pattern in the location of rental buildings, which is only natural, as most of them had reached the Scuole through private bequests. One can often perceive, though, a large building in the vicinity of the seat of a scuola, Castelforte, close to San Rocco, a block of 18 houses next to San Giovanni on Fondamenta Gradenigo, and another block opposite at San Stin, Corte Nuova, in front of the new albergo of the Misericordia. Total rental houses of the Scuole at the end of Cinquecento, 500 flats ranging in rent from 3-4 ducats per year to more than 100. San Marco, 14 houses, Carità, 75, Misericordia, 41, San Giovanni, 82, San Rocco, 152, including 2 commissarie later than the Condizione 1581. Not included, of course, botteghe, shops, wine shops, bastioni, and magazzini, storages. Things are very different as far as almshouses are concerned. It is immediately evident that all large houses or groups of houses are located in peripheral, marginal areas of the city. If we refer once more to the research of Ennio Conscience and his identification of poorer districts of the city, we find precise correspondences. The important suburb areas are San Pietro di Castello, San Geremia, and the northern section of Cannaregio, most of Dorsoduro, and the zone under progressive decadence between San Giacomo d'Allorio and San Simeone. And in each of these suburbs, almshouses are located. At San Pietro di Castello, 26 houses in Corte San Zuanne, belonging to the namesake Scuola, 5 houses in Corte San Marco, a group of about 11 small houses of the Misericordia, which will become more in the next century. In Dorsoduro, 10 houses in San Nicolò, belonging to San Giovanni, a number of detached houses, and, most important, the 2 large neighboring corti, built on areas of new land reclamation, with 24 houses of San Marco and 44 of San Rocco, at the terreni nuovi of Santa Maria Maggiore. The Scuole of San Giovanni, located in the Sestiere of Santa Croce, manages a number of small houses between San Simeone and San Giacomo, and here especially a corte of 12 dwellings. At San Geremia, finally, 2 parallel rows belonging respectively to the Carità and the Misericordia. Reasons for this location of almshouses are evident. Cheaper lots of land, therefore minor loss for the fraternity in building and dispensing houses. Something else comes immediately into view, and this is the proximity of blocks belonging to different scuole. The 2 aforementioned rows at San Geremia, 2 large courts at Angelo Raffaele, and the nearby Corte San Marco in Santa Croce, 3 scuole neighboring each other in Castello. It is hard to tell if this choice is dictated by a precise intention of grouping the poor together in given areas, or rather comes from the sheer financial suitability of certain lands. Let's not forget that the poor whom the scuole offered to assist were mostly brothers of the same fraternity, or, in any event, people da ben, nice people, good people, worthy workers, as wills as capitoli di scuola never tired of underlining. One can therefore infer that special areas were chosen with a view to the location of working places, in addition to the financial convenience. I shall now attempt a closer examination of residential buildings erected by the scuola during the 16th century, paying particular attention to the differences between buildings to be let and buildings to be given free. It goes without saying that dwellings were different, the first being much larger and comfortable. The 2 types differ in terms of the number of floors. Corte San Marco, for instance, those almshouses are normally 2 stories, and this is also true of complexes built by other institutions, as the Corte delle Procuratie in 1504. Rental houses range from 3 to 5 floors, including 1 or 2 piano nobile, the main residential part of the house, roof mezzanine, and sometimes another mezzanine over the ground floor. Another element of differentiation is the height of each floor. Both floors are of the same height, about 2.8 meters high in almshouses. While the rental house, as here in Castelforte San Rocco, each floor is different according to its utilization. As an example, both Castelforte San Rocco and the houses at Santa Maria Zobenigo have the following heights: 9 Venetian feet for the ground floor, 10 feet each for the piani nobili, and 7 feet for the roof mezzanine or attic. Castelforte, this one, has also a first floor mezzanine reaching the total elevation of almost 48 feet, so 16.70 meters. And this proved a serious concern for the Capitolo di San Pantalone, seller of the land. The priests had asked the Scuola to limit its building to un soler con soffitta, which means just one noble floor with the last mezzanine, instead of two, in order not to damage their own nearby rental house. They complained bitterly about the decision of the Scuola to build a house on the land which, they maintained, had been sold to allow the Scuola to build new, wider staircases for their magnificent new seat, and to give una piazza, to give a square to this splendid building, a square in front of the mentioned magnificent building that happens in the main city of Italy, where private men, I'm quoting, spend endless sums of money to give a view to their palaces. And remembering also, again quoting, the good memory of Serenissimo Principe Gritti, who had visited the Scuola with the company of many noblemen. Moreover, they argue that the investment would be a very bad one, due to the high cost of the lot of land they sold, together with the expenses for the construction, and that investing the money in zecca or monti, state loan funds, would be much safer. There are also references to scandals and mormorazioni, rumors, originated by the new building. We could find it a bit strange that a piazza, even if permitting a better view from and of the albergo, represent a better investment than a house. Besides, even if putting money into the Monti represented a sound investment, there was always the risk of liquidation. Investment in real property was, according to Brian Pullan, exactly the means through which the Scuola of San Rocco avoided, I'm quoting, the ill effects of the liquidation of the Monti. This was evidently the thought of the brothers of San Rocco, as Castelforte, in spite of the complaints of the priests, was built and built with no economy, indeed. Indeed, the Scuola employed one of the most famous architects of the days, Scarpagnino, who was then proto of the Scuola and engaged in the difficult planning and realization of its seat. Not only this, but to make the building all the more appealing, the two facades, which have a visual relationship with the albergo, were painted a fresco, according to the tradition of palaces and important buildings, Fontego dei Tedeschi. To cite one conspicuous example. The painter of Castelforte paid 45 ducats in 1550, was a certain Vitrulio Buonconsiglio. Not a very famous one, but still the building had its decoration. The frescoes are still discernible in an engraving of 1829. Castelforte was a particularly luxurious rental building, due perhaps to its spatial location bordering the seat of the Scuola, being almost part of it, and therefore bound to represent it to the passerby. Nevertheless, the pattern is one which is common to most of rental housing of the same level. Rents, this kind of houses, from 30 to 70 ducats per year approximately, built by private investors. It is a pattern of high architectural dignity, imitating, sometimes very cleverly, the design of contemporary palazzi. As for almshouses, their style is extremely simple, and the builder uses ingenious devices to obtain certain decorative effects. I will not embark on a detailed description of the two types of houses, as I have already abused the passions of my British listeners with this subject more than once. Let me only underline the different dimension of the dwellings. 50 square meters for one charity flat, opposed to the 500 of each flat of a rental apartment as in Castelforte. But there are other special features marking the two categories of houses. One of the most important, the urban setting of buildings. Rental houses, at least from the last decade of the 15th century, were built according to a new, rational layout with more and more sophisticated organization of space, allowing a better utilization of land, with a higher building density, approximately 14 cubic meter per square meter. The Scuole also built using the modern techniques, and their houses cannot be distinguished from contemporary residences built by private entrepreneurs, as in Case Cappello, middle of the 16th century. Same building in axonometric view. We find a completely different state of affairs concerning almshouses. Urban layout, plan, inner and outer organization, style, every element points to archaic typologies of medieval taste. There is no trying here to intensively exploit the available building plot. On the contrary, a great waste of urban land. Dwellings rise around a courtyard, either square or elongated in shape, according to a layout typically used for ensembles of low-class residential housing, quite widespread in medieval Venice. We find here, therefore, a propensity towards tradition not to be met with the building for investment, as in Corte San Marco, here, or in Corte San Rocco. The courtyard offers a collective space, gives room to amenities in its center, the pozzo, the cistern is located, and works as a social unit. This kind of layout does not permit intensively to charity housing. Concina's research shows that investment in real estate, when directed to low-class housing, has a preference for corte di case, perhaps till the middle of the century. At the same time, it is interesting to see that buildings for lower-class housing, not for charity but for rent, built in this same period by Scuole of San Rocco, do not match this type, following, on the contrary, what I have called the modern typology. Caesar staircases, internal cistern, and so forth. This is true for the blocks built at San Stin and Sant'Andrea. In both cases, rather lower class buildings, paying rents between 5 and 23 ducats per year. Very interesting, on the other hand, the case of the two charity buildings at San Geremia, one belonging to the Misericordia, the other to La Carità, built in such a way as to generate an inner calle corte, so that the suggestion of a joint operation by the two fraternities presents itself very strongly. It would be interesting to check, and I hope to be able to do so in the future, if private investment in lower class residential housing keeps faith with this scheme of building, or little by little drops it. At the moment, I can only quote the case of the row of houses built around the 50s by the merchant Muti at San Geremia. Some of the dwellings are very humble at the ground floor, and some of the new building systems are employed. But it has only 3 floors and could be looked at as a wing of a courtyard. As for the quality of these homes, it is certain that in many cases they were far from being at the lowest level of poverty. When, around the middle of the century, the brothers of the Scuole of San Marco argued about how to correctly assign houses belonging to the Commissaria Olivieri, someone was complaining because the orders of the testator had not been respected. According to his will, the Scuola was bound to build dwellings which, if rented, could get 5 or 6 ducats per year. Instead, the ones actually built, if rented, would, I'm quoting, undoubtedly yield from 12 to 14 ducats each. In the same vein, when in 1661 the Scuola of San Rocco rented its houses at Angelo Raffaele, the rents ranged between 12 and 25 ducats. The capitolo of the Scuola della Misericordia offers some interesting comments about the houses in Corte Nuova. The attitude of the brothers seems rather ambiguous. On one hand, they repeatedly express care for the well-being of the inhabitants. So there is a parte providing for the building of a cistern per la comodità di coloro stanno nelle case, for the inhabitants of the houses nearby. Another one orders to provide for every need of the inhabitants, as the houses non hanno le sue comodità et bisogni. They don't have their facilities and what they need. On the other hand, one finds endless remarks directed against waste in the everyday maintenance of almshouses, forbidding any improvement or futile adornment. This is a complaint that appears again and again. We are made to understand that guardiani and vicari of the Scuola are often persuaded to give permission for works che non se faria se quelle case affittar se dovessero, and let the money of the Scuola to be spent in cose molto superflue e ornamenti somptuosi a pompa. Could there be here a little memory of Caravia's lashes? This squandering of money meant to be used for the relief of the poor, if not to be tolerated and must be severely repressed. Moreover, the houses were not built con quella modestia se averia possuto far, so much so that a few years after the building of Corte Nuova, a very serious provision is taken. As these houses are of very good level, and the number of poor to be assisted increases every day, the Scuola decides to divide each flat into 2 dwellings, so as to satisfy a double number of poor brothers. We are commonly confronted with a contradiction between what some capi felt was necessary for the property and dignity of the Scuola, having perhaps in mind also the propinquity of the Corte to the new albergo, and the more and more impelling requests of charity. It is difficult to discover which opinion prevailed in the end. What is certain is that party condemning, blaming, forbidding superfluous expenses for almshouses are notably frequent. I have come now to the culmination of my research. How much did the Scuole spend to build either rental houses or almshouses? problems and problems. Information is very sparse and incoherent from the 16th century, so much so that it is hard even to formulate an hypothesis. I have a few documents concerning the building of the last 2 blocks of almshouses of the Procuratori di San Marco de Supra on the Terreni Nuovi at Santa Maria Maggiore, built under the direction of Jacopo Sansovino. But they are so incomplete and have so many gaps that do not throw any light on the costs of the building as a whole. Nor do the notatori and quaderni di cassa, expense registers, of the Scuola help. They never provide evidence regarding the estimated cost of a proposed and approved enterprise. The Capitolo seems to adhere to a very practical attitude. It will cost what it will cost. And this is in sharp contrast to the punctilious care taken to register the smallest expenses for repair and maintenance of existing buildings. One gets the impression that the brothers knew very well how much the Scuola was bound to spend for the projected designed house, or that they were all ready to spend whatever was necessary. What we do have are some budget estimates and final accounts for rental buildings built by different owners, scuole, procuratori, private investors, convents, etc. We also have some sale prices which can be used as further references. Some examples. Case d'Anna, rental houses, 1553, density 11.14, sold in 84 for 25,000 ducats. So the sale price in lira on cubic meter the rate is 8.1. San Simeon Grande, built by the Scuola in 1559, density 12.5, cost 2.99, 3 lira per cubic meter. But there is a problem here. Corte del Forno, monastery of San Zaccaria, 1615, high density, 16.4, estimate 20,000 ducats, so that the cost, estimated cost per square cubic meter in lira will be 20.1. The rental houses of Procuratori of San Marco in Calle degli Armeni, 1615, density almost 17 cubic meters. Final account of expenses for building, 15,000 ducats, which makes 8.5 the rate cost. They were sold 30 years later for 10 lira per cubic meter. So it was a loss. Campo della Bragora, built by the Monastero of Santo Sepolcro in 1671, 10 cubic meters, that's the density. And the cost was 22 lira per meter. Salizzada San Provolo, 1735, density 14.4, estimated cost 17.10. Calle dei Balloni, end of 18th century, Scuole della Misericordia, rental houses, density 16, expenses 39.3 lira per cubic meter. It is impossible to compare the values per cubic meter, as we have only in some cases only final accounts, and in other cases only estimated budgets, which can, of course, always change. Selling prices, in their turn, are only relatively relevant. If, for some reason, one is obliged to sell, this can have a strong influence on the price of the sale. Paolo Danna, guardian grande della Scuola di San Rocco, in 1577, sold his double row here of 20 houses for rental houses in 84, the year of the terrible bank failure of the Pisani and Tiepolo. What impact did this have on the Danna family? I have Brian Pullan to thank again for the information. In 93, Paolo's widow appeals to the school for an almshouse and seems to have lost everything, including her dowry. This could suggest an involvement to Paolo in the crash, and, as a consequence, a compulsory sale. The contract of the mason Francesco di Fermo, it was the problematic one, with the Scuole of San Rocco, on the other hand, includes such an abnormally low payment for masonry work that it cannot be taken into account. For the buildings in Corte del Forno and Salizzada San Provolo, we have only estimated budgets. Therefore, they cannot be used. The block in Calle degli Armeni, on the contrary, gives the global expenditure for the works, and the owners maintain them to have been low. The buildings at the Bragora and in Calle dei Balloni offer, above the global expenditure, another very interesting information: the share of expenditure for each item of the works. So we have eventually the cost of bricks, sand, lime, water, timber, carpenter, mason, stonemason, etc. This information makes it possible to compare the two different periods in two instances: the trend of rise in prices, 1615, 8.5 lira per cubic meter, 1671, 22 lira per cubic meter, 1789, 39 lira per cubic meter. And that on the rise of prices of each item of the building works as follows. Masonry and similar works in 1671 are the 40% of the total expense. In 1789, the 52. The carpenter, 34, and 25, 120 years later. The stonemason, 19, later 14. The blacksmith, 7 versus 9. The most notable change in this period of more than a century concerned the rise in the price of masonry, over 30%. The same is true for the blacksmith, but it's so small that the sums in question, that doesn't change, the change doesn't mean much. It is worth noting that the price of materials is almost stable, while the cost of manpower rises. Those are the materials. The cost of manpower rises dramatically from 1600 to 1789. Moreover, as the graphics make clear, one can establish that the cost of material rises significantly in the course of the 16th century up to the middle of the 17th, while in the same period the cost of labor rises very little. In the next century and a half, as we have already discussed, the situation is reversed. In conclusion, let me say that I am aware that I have not given you a final answer to the question of the cost of the almshouses, and I am afraid that I cannot yet do so. But I want to indicate the line of research that will provide, hopefully, the answer. Taking into consideration that Venetian residential construction outside the category of the palazzo remains substantially the same from the 16th century to the end of the 18th century, as regards type, quantity of materials, technology, and working procedure, it is possible to use the building estimate as a basis for laying out a line of research. Having in hand account books for the construction of certain buildings, specifying expenses paid out for each part of the construction, that is, the cost of the masonry work, the cost of materials, the cost of stone cutting, of the carpentry, of the fabrication of windows, of the laying down of floors, of paintings, etc., one can calculate the percentage that each one of these occupies vis-à-vis the total cost. Essential, of course, is a reliable metric survey of the building, which can be used even if the building itself no longer exists, so that the elements of fabrication can be measured. Thus, we have a building formula, and in fact, two of them. One for the 1671 and one for 1789, as we have already seen, which provide a reliable guide when used in conjunction with other elements in the chronological span of the 3 centuries studied, the cost of labor, of materials, and the necessary adjustments for inflation, etc. I am aware that there is one more problem by virtue of the fact that the formula arises out of an examination of middle-class buildings, while it would be most useful to be able to apply it to other types of buildings, either more modest or modern luxurious. This can be done without much difficulty, utilizing a simple rate of reduction or increase based on a better or a lesser quality of construction materials. If this research is successful, it will be possible to apply the formula, and even better, to utilize a specific formula developed for different periods and for different building types, always bearing in mind that we are dealing with buildings other than palazzi. Knowing only one of the costs within the entire scenario of construction, we can establish the expenses of the entire project. Thank you.
Now we're going to have as our respondent Professor Pullan. We've had a number of references to you already in Giorgio Gianighian's presentation. Professor Pullan is the author of Rich and Poor in Renaissance Venice, and he is Professor of History at the University of Manchester. Professor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. When Nubar and I discussed this little matter in Venice, he asked me just what a respondent was expected to do, and he asked me, do you have to be rude? So I was perfectly certain that was not going to happen. Indeed, very much the reverse, because I'm sure everyone would want me to thank Nubar most warmly for his splendid relazione, which embodies the kind of nitty-gritty research that can only be done by someone who's both an architect and a Venetian, with an exhaustive knowledge of Venice's topography, other than somebody like me that just descends on Venice every so long, struggles against the clock in the archive, and then goes away again. Needless to say, I'm not an architectural historian, but a social historian of religion. And the other thing perhaps a respondent does is go off on tangents of his own, prompted by the paper he's just heard. When I was last in Italy, there were, of course, a lot of very large posters up, all of which said, Fuga Tangentopoli, beware of Tangentopolis. But here, anyway, are one or two tangents. Tangent one, we've heard Dr. Gianighian speak about 3 different kinds of building in which the Scuole Grandi engaged. First, the construction and the splendid decoration of the headquarters of the Scuole itself, the clubhouse of the Venetian Guild, as Berenson in The Passionate Sightseer once called the Scuola di San Rocco. the albergo, the great hall from which the processions departed, the place where the administration was carried out. Secondly, the maintenance and construction of houses which would be rented out to generate an income, to produce revenues which would be applied to a variety of religious and charitable uses, either at the discretion of the governing body of the Scuole or in accordance with the instructions of pious benefactors. And as he explained to us, there wasn't always a terribly clear distinction between the splendid headquarters of the Scuole itself and certain buildings adjacent to it which were also intended to dignify it, such as the Castelforte construction of San Rocco. Thirdly, we have the construction of premises, both small hospitals like dormitories and case amore dei, almshouses or groupings of independent dwellings, which were destined for habitation by the poorer brothers of the Scuole and their families. Well, how did these forms of building reflect the ideals of the Scuole, and how far did they in turn change the character of the Scuole themselves? This threefold activity might perhaps be seen as an example of what sociologists used to call role confusion on the part of an institution which had extraordinarily varied functions. So to get the balance between them was very difficult, and nobody would be totally satisfied, whatever you did. That happened partly because multiplicity of purpose was in the nature of religious confraternities in general. In any city or village of Renaissance Europe, they did an extraordinary variety of things. And it happened partly because the Scuole Grandi had developed certain particular characteristics as Venetian institutions which made them different from most other confraternities in most other places. Well, what did confraternities in general really set out to do, and where did the building come into it? John Bossi, in his book Christianity in Europe, argues that their purpose, wherever they were, was to exemplify a state of charity, that is, of love between equals, as distinct from mercy, which implied transactions between superior and inferior. Charity included almsgiving and poor relief, but it extended to many other things for which money and material goods were not strictly necessary at all. Things like the composition of quarrels, the comforting of widows, vigils over corpses, and the correction of faults such as blasphemy, drunkenness, gambling, and living in concubinage. They all had their favourite sins that they set out to prescribe and for which you got expelled from the school. Confraternities existed, one might say also, to prepare for death, to accumulate merit collectively by following a simplified version of a monastic rule, to do penance on behalf of a community and to expiate its sins, to arrange funerals and pray for the dead, to show charity even to those beyond the grave suffering in purgatory, for who was more deserving of charity, according to medieval ways of thinking, than suffering souls who were in a much worse state than the living poor. And they strove to honour God, the Virgin, and the saints, particularly their chosen one, through ritual, ceremony, and pageantry. Within that very broad framework, there could be enormous differences in the emphasis placed by individual confraternities on a particular form of activity. And there was much room for controversy as to which was the most desirable and how you balanced one against the other, how you balanced display against almsgiving. There was a substantial difference between confraternities that acquired legacies and became public trustees on a large scale, and those confraternities that did not, but rather remained simply almsgiving societies with no fixed resources, no fixed capital, as it were, other than the purses of the brothers serving at any one time. I wonder, incidentally, whether that was the reason why you never kept exact accounts about how much the almshouses were going to cost, because the shortfall could always be made up by the people who happened to be serving on the governing body at the time. That is just a guess, but it seems to me that an awful lot was going on in these scuole, which simply came out of people's back pockets, the back pockets of the officers, and didn't get into the official accounts at all. But still, sorry, back to the theme, or rather back to the tangent. The Venetian Scuole Grandi, like Or San Michele in Florence, or like some of the prominent scuole of Milan, belong very much to the category of the propertied confraternity, at least from the time of the Black Death onwards. Investment in the property market was in many respects safer than investment in government bonds, though much more troublesome, of course, in the sense that it involved repairs, rent collection, and a great deal of administration. The acquisition of property, especially in the form of buildings, had a very profound effect on the character of the scuole, at least in the sense that they ceased to be brotherhoods of equal persons, as they'd originally set out to be. They divided internally into recognized orders of rich and poor, paying differential entrance fees and recognizing different obligations. Some people entered with a view to administering the scuola and being part of the governing body, the Banca and Zonta, a thing which could be done only by literate people who had administrative experience and could at least understand an income and expenditure account. Other people did so with the intention that they should be of the discipline. That is, people who did the dirty work, or rather the drabber and more unspectacular kinds of work, such as turning out for funerals and lugging the heavy weights in the processions, carrying the ombrello, carrying the enormously heavy wooden Cristo of the Scuola di San Rocco, and so forth. The reward of performing in this way, they were known as the fatigue men or the sfadigenti, which will be a phrase recognizable to all who've had the misfortune to serve in the army. The sfadigenti, their reward was eligibility for the charitable benefits of the scuola, including the almshouses. You had to be a good boy and turn out promptly and be ticked off on the register, and in time you would accumulate the credits which would get you your almshouse. So it seems then, from the point of view of a social historian, that the acquisition of house property helped to promote this important development within the scuole themselves, a departure from the original ideals of charitable equality in favour of what one might call a new ethic of mercy, based on a functional division between those who manage and those who receive in return for certain services. Another consequence, of course, I mean, this was something mentioned briefly by Deborah Howard when she gave us a sketch earlier of what the Scuole Grandi were about and who ran them. Another consequence was that the Scuole Grandi began to dispose of considerable reserves of patronage. The houses they leased, the houses they gave out, and so forth. And that during the 15th century, the state became eager that the administration of the scuole, like that of the ducal chancery, should be in the hands of persons who could be trusted, of citizens who had identified themselves with the Venetian state, as distinct from recent immigrants, especially from the colonies. A side effect of this process was to give increasing recognition to a social category of cives populares, or commoner citizens. The only real citizens, of course, were the nobility themselves, the only people who had full political rights. But there were others, the so-called commoner citizens, well-to-do persons outside the ranks of the closed patriciate. High office in the Scuole Grandi became their preserve, one of the things that gave them status and an identity. And exponents of the 16th century myth of Venice suggested that they were almost a form of parallel republic, a state in microcosm, established, circumscribed, almost a state within a state, designed for the purpose of absorbing the frustrated political ambitions of the citizenry. So, another function of building in general was, as it were, to enhance their sense of their own importance by providing them with magnificent premises. In theory, the great alberghi built in the 16th century honoured the patron saint, but critics like the goldsmith poet Alessandro Caravia, of whom we've heard several times in Nubar's paper, and I think perhaps earlier, critics like the poet Caravia charged the officers with building only for their own glory and for diverting funds from the poor. It was he who most vociferously spoke of the dilemma, display or charity. A dilemma always inherent in the structure of the Venetian confraternities themselves. Reformers in Zurich in the 1520s were urging that the poor were the only true images of Christ. But in Catholic societies, God was still honoured through the splendours of a richly decorated fabric, through imagery, through splendid altars, and so forth. As we've heard, there was also a third kind of building, the purpose-built almshouse, specifically directed towards the poor of the Scuole. But who were the poor of the Scuole? As Nubar has so rightly pointed out, they were never the poorest of the poor, in any case. As a Milanese observer, Battista Sfondrato, pointed out about 1500, the Scuole, because they charged entrance fees, didn't go much below the level of respectable craftsmen, and certainly not down to the level of beggars. The fact that, as has been pointed out, almshouses were relatively well appointed, they were almost desirable residences, and certainly not hovels, reminds us of the fact that there was in fact a hierarchy of poverty, just as there was a hierarchy of everything else on the upper levels of Venetian society, a hierarchy which extended from the shamefaced or respectable poor, the vergognosi, down to the homeless mendicant, the great difference being between those who would beg and those who wouldn't. And charitable provision here in the Scuole Grandi of Venice, as elsewhere, was intended to correspond to the condition of the person obtaining it. Nubar mentioned the petition of the widow of a former Guardian Grande of the Scuola Grandi di San Rocco, that is of the family of Danna, Paola Danna. She wrote in 1593 in great distress and said, I am utterly destitute. Presumably her dowry had gone, as was stated. And she said, can't you let me have one of your houses on the Giudecca, which you let for 5 or 6 ducats each? And it's not much good you're doing that anywhere because you can never collect the rents. And they said, well, we will accede to your petition, but the resolution they actually took was to put her into one which cost at least 15 ducats a year to rent, because that would be much more compatible with her condition. And that was about the level at which many of the almshouses were actually let. Nubar's references to the letting of almshouses should remind us of the extent to which the state interfered with and taxed the Scuole. he referred to many occasions on which these were actually leased for a rent. And that, I think, was largely because of the pressure of state taxation, and also because of the fact the state very frequently insisted that rather than putting in the poor of their choice, the most needy, the Scuole Grandi should actually put in people who have served in the galleys. Some of them, be it recorded, actually turned up their nose at the almshouses when they were offered them and couldn't be persuaded to occupy them directly because they liked their own houses rather better. And if they were weavers, they couldn't move their looms in because the floors weren't strong enough. So getting the poor to occupy the almshouses, des reses though they were, was often the nunnery of the convertite for repentant prostitutes. One thinks of the catechumeni for converts from Judaism and Islam, all within shouting distance of each other in the Dorsodoro Giudecca area. Relegation to the periphery in Venice could certainly be a way of slapping people down. One thinks of the Jews in 1516, how they naturally gathered in the parishes closest to Rialto, like Santa Maria Marta Domini, but then were pushed outwards towards the edge, to the Ghetto, as it was first called, in Cannaregio. But on the other hand, could one really describe Cannaregio as a whole as really a marginal popular quarter? The Jews, after all, had fairly distinguished neighbours, including the English ambassadors who lived just round the corner. Sir Henry Wotton, Sir Dudley Carleton. They were always complaining of being conned by the Venetians, but I don't think the Venetians let them a bad house. And if I remember Deborah Howard's book on San Silvino, that sort of Cannaregio area, or the edge of it, was also a place where nobles liked to build palaces with gardens in search of a good view over to the mainland and the mountains. So that really ends the tangents I've been going off at, and the second one consists entirely of questions raised by Nubar's most interesting paper. Thank you.
I've got a tiny bit